Welcome to another Stories of Healing episode. In this episode, we're going to talk about a woman named Sarah. Of course, not a real specific person, but a person that is a combining of real people and a variety of different conversations I've had with people and experiences and interactions I've had with people that I think have a commonality or a general profile that I think will be relatable for many to hear and understand. This is a complex situation, simple on the one hand, but complex on the other hand, very common and very relatable. And I do not have all the answers to this. It's challenging in its simplicity and how basic it is. But I want to offer a certain perspective that I think might be helpful. So Sarah is a person who comes from a healthy and positive background and experience in her life and is emotionally very present. She has worked on herself a lot by nature. She was a little bit more of the perfectionistic type, did very well in school, was always in the good group, etc. And she has worked on herself a lot over the past few years, both emotionally and spiritually, to become less rigid and less kind of by the books in a way that was a little too much. She was healthy and good and everything was fine, but she has really developed more of a feeling experience in this world, and that has increased her spiritual experience a lot. She's become a lot more connected. She describes feeling a sense of a lot more meaning in her life, and she is attending different opportunities for women to grow and learn and connect with each other, and she's taking advantage of all the more spiritual offerings that exist now in the Frum community for women who are looking to connect and grow in their relationship with Hashem, relationship with each other, etc. She's connecting a lot to all of this, and all of that is very positive. She feels very good about all of this. She's a more open person emotionally. She will share more. She can listen more. She can attune more. She feels good about this with her kids. She feels good about this with her friends. She feels really good about this with herself and with Hashem. The challenge is that she describes her husband as someone who is an amazing person. She says he's a great guy. He does all the right things, but she doesn't feel that he is in that same place emotionally, and she doesn't expect him to be in the same place, but that he is much more of the, I do what's right, I do my responsibility, my job, and I'm not sure what more you really want from me. I don't really get this whole thing. I think this whole emotional thing is more of a woman's thing. This is how women are. I don't really know what you want from me. She doesn't feel so much connection to him in that deeper way. She doesn't experience him having a sense of vulnerability, an openness to emotions. He doesn't get upset at her about her emotions or anything like that. But he'll even listen and indulge or indulge her, entertain her with it, by listening and being present. But he doesn't really. She doesn't get the sense that he really feels with her or really knows what it even means when she's expressing her emotions, and he is certainly not expressing any of his own. And similarly, in terms of his spirituality, she describes that he does the right things. He goes to minyan, he is careful about what he needs to be, and he learns, and he gives tzedakah, and he's involved in the community and all these things, But again, there's not, for her, she doesn't experience that there's a sense of something deeper, that there's a relationship, that there's a meaning that's taking place in his experience. And this leaves her feeling, in many ways, isolated. And so even though she has all these positive relationships and feels so good about all the growth that she's experienced in the past few years, the challenge is that with the growth became more of an acute gap between her and her husband in this regard. They're not having strife or conflict over it, but she just feels a sense of being lonely and kind of stuck. So what does she do with this? Like I said, I think this is challenging in how common and basic and understandable this is. This is a very understandable situation, a very normal situation. And to some degree, Sarah's husband might actually be right. to some degree, there is oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, a difference in gender in this way, that women have more of a connection and sense of that deeper, vulnerable, emotional side to them, and men have more of a connection to the doing, taking care of things, responsibility side of themselves. But also because culturally, what has happened is that those kind of prototypes of gender and those predispositions that are often true within gender culturally became even more extreme in the way that men are oftentimes not really given environments or experiences culturally, educationally, communally to really develop the experience of emotional awareness, emotional intelligence, the idea that dependency, relationships, vulnerability can be a good thing. There's much more of a propping up of the male type of not needing anything, being able to assert oneself and be successful, and all those kinds of things that have a lot of benefits and a lot of positivity to them. But in this regard of relationship, there's something that might be missing for a lot of people. So what I tried painting for her as a picture for understanding and a way to approach this is that one of the most important things is to understand that a person's system at its core, most fundamental place is always trying to keep them as safe as possible. All of us have an unconscious instinct and impulse towards safety. And safety doesn't always just mean physical safety. It can even mean emotional safety. And for whatever reasons, if a person feels emotionally unsafe, and that doesn't have to be because her husband or anyone went through any kind of objective major trauma of some incident that was scary or hurtful or painful, and therefore they needed safety, but it could just be because of the underlying cultural environment of what it means to fit in as a man. It feels more safe to try and fit in by sometimes not having so much connection or expression of emotion. And since we are all hardwired with an unconscious instinct to move towards safety, if the culture, if the family, if the community, if the society is one in which a person feels more of, as a man, feels more of a sense of safety by not experiencing an acute sense of emotional vulnerability, but instead actually by not feeling very much emotion at all, if that creates more of a sense of safety, that is what their system will move towards. That's what we will anchor ourselves in. We'll anchor ourselves in, we'll create an internal structure and system in which we feel perfectly okay by not feeling. The not feeling is a feeling of being perfectly okay. And it's not that there's a conscious experience, like if you try and talk to someone like this, meaning somebody who has this experience in this internal world that I'm describing, and you try and name this to them, they're not going to know what you're talking about because they're not experiencing a lack of safety in which they then found safety by not having emotion. They didn't experience any lack of safety to begin with because as the initial instinct, the way to feel safe was to not feel not safe. So there's no awareness, there's no experience of I'm choosing to not feel because otherwise I would feel unsafe. The whole point, the whole experience is that by not feeling, I feel safe, meaning I don't experience the not feeling safe. It's so built in, it's so automatic. So the person will have no concept of this because even to talk about this, even to have an awareness of this, that itself is a vulnerability. And I think that we need to understand when we look at the other person here that if they're not feeling, there's a reason for that. If there isn't so much space or capacity for emotional vulnerability, for connection in that kind of a way, for expression or empathy in that kind of a way, it's not because the person is just not interested. It's not because the person is even fundamentally incapable. It's not because they don't care, and it's not even necessarily because they don't want it. It's because that is how their system programmed to experience the world in a way that felt safe. That could be because of something more serious in an acute kind of a way, and it could be, like I was saying before, in a more pervasive kind of systemic way, meaning to say that it was just a sense of safety by, I want to fit in. I want to be a regular guy. Not because there was something bad going on, but I just want to be a regular guy. I want to fit in. And to be a regular guy and fit in means that I don't really experience the ups and downs, the swinging back and forth of vulnerable emotions. I'm just okay. I'm fine. I go through doing what I'm supposed to do, and that's how I define and identify myself, and that's how I engage with the world. Now, if we can understand that the way a person will be, the reason a person will be that way is because that's how they've created safety in their internal system. We can then understand, if we have that perspective, we can then understand that trying to pressure them, trying to push them, trying to bring out emotion from them in a way in which they're feeling criticized or pressured or forced, or that they're not doing something right, is not only not going to be successful at bringing out their emotion, but it's actually going to get them, whether they want to or not, it's going to actually most likely shut down their emotional response even more. Because again, if the reason a person doesn't have the more emotional experience is because there's more safety for them in not feeling their emotions, when they then feel pressured or pushed or forced, or they feel that they're not understood or appreciated and they're not good enough, they're being criticized, that's going to create within them, understandably, more of a feeling of not being safe. And now let's think about it from that person's internal unconscious perspective. When I don't feel safe, what is my go-to? What do I do when I need safety? I shut down emotion. So I want to, now as the spouse, I want to get their emotional world to come out. So I pressure them. I try and I try to get it out of them. But they experience that not now as not being safe. Something's not safe here. There's a threat. There's someone that's upset at me. So I don't feel safe. What does my system do when I don't feel safe? I shut down emotion more. So all that's going to happen if I come home from my inspired place of emotional awareness and I try and get the emotion out of my spouse, all I'm going to be doing is pushing them further into their coping mechanism of shutting down emotion, because I've now recreated a lack of safety for them. And their coping mechanism for a lack of safety is to shut down emotion. Now, this, I think, is true, but I also understand why this is so frustrating for the person who wants their spouse's emotion to come out, because what I'm essentially saying is it's a catch-22. You're kind of trapped. You're kind of stuck. What can you do? Just to explain this a little bit more, add a little bit more perspective on understanding where the person's coming from. If anyone's listened to my content in other contexts, I talk a lot about the concept of attachment styles. And one of the attachment styles is what they call avoidant attachment style. Avoidant attachment style in the extreme is someone who really creates a sense of total independence and individuality, so much so that they don't need relationships. They don't want relationships. They create a front and an experience in which, at least on a conscious level, they experience themselves as not being interested in relationships. When it's less extreme, they will have relationships, but the relationships will be more aloof, more distant. They will shut down from the person more frequently. And then even less extreme, they'll have more connected relationships, but it's still more of a errands, business affair type of relationship. There won't really be depth, there won't be vulnerability, closeness, etc. And it exists on a spectrum. Underneath the avoidant attachment style is the experience. The reason why the person does that is because if they experience the need for a relationship as something that's going to create a lack of safety for them, because they may not get the relationship they're looking for, they might not know how to navigate the relationships, they might feel hurt or pain or sadness in the relationship. Therefore, one of the ways to deal with that is to just create a sense of, I don't even need the relationship at all. Why should I try out for the team and take the risk of being hurt by being rejected? I might as well just not try out. Why would I keep working here and get fired? I might as well just quit. It reduces the pain. It stops it before it could start. So I have an avoidant attachment style. Now, if you imagine a child in school, a student in school, who has an avoidant attachment style, and there's a teacher who is trying to be a really good teacher and is inviting the students for something after school, something fun, some social event or experience, something that's meant to be bonding and inspiring. If there is an avoidant attachment style student, that student might be more reluctant to come. They may not want to attend. Naturally, the teacher, from a good place of wanting to include them, may go over to that student and try and get them to come. Oftentimes, in a way, inadvertently, in a way that the student will experience as being pressured. Now, sometimes that will work to get the student to go, but that's just on the outside. On the inside, when the student who has an avoidant attachment style, so think about it, if the student has an avoidant attachment style, that is likely because they relate to relationships as something that will not be a good experience, will not have good feelings. I'll feel something not good if I'm in a relationship. And now what did the teacher just inadvertently do? They engaged with the student in a relationship in a way of pressuring them, in a way that made them feel criticized. So it just reinforced the sense that when someone engages me in a close way, it doesn't feel good. So they've just now, even if the student does attend, they've just doubled down. They've reinforced that sense that relationships are not a place that will feel good. And it actually will lead to, in the bigger picture or in the long run, leads to more of that avoidance in the attachment style. What should the teacher do? And this will bring us back to our situation. What should the teacher do in such a situation? Just leave the kid completely? So I think that what a teacher can do in a situation like that is they can go over to the student the first time in the year that something like this happens and say, I just want you to know that if you choose not to come, I totally understand. And that's it. Because in doing that, we have to think about the long term, not the short term. So in the short term, it's possible they won't come. And if I had pressured them, it's possible they would have come. So someone might think that the pressure was the success and the not pressure was the not success, but it's actually the opposite in the long term. Because by not pressuring them and actually acknowledging the legitimacy of what they're feeling without saying too much, because they don't want to hear it too much, they don't want the vulnerability of it, but giving them the explicit permission, that just created an experience of a relationship, of a relational moment that was safe. And then a teacher can slowly move that over, inch that over. They can go to the student the next time and say, I just want you to know that if you decide not to come, that's totally okay. And if you do decide to come, I'd be so happy. And that's it. And slowly moving it over, because what you've just given them is the experience of safety in a relationship. And that's how it can shift. So what does Sarah do in this situation with her husband? The answer is certainly not to go and start pressuring and pushing and trying to force it out of the husband. I think that there's a few things she can do and a few things she can try. And it's not simple. It's really not. And it's not going to be a quick fix. But I think the first thing is that Sarah can believe in the possibility of unconscious communication, of unspoken expression, unspoken communication. That our thoughts and our feelings are powerful. There's an energy that exists in our body language and in the way that we think of a person, the way that we relate to them, even without the other person consciously knowing, and even without us saying anything explicitly. So the way that I think about this is that Sarah's conscious thoughts can actually communicate to her husband's unconscious self. Meaning, it might not be smart for Sarah to say something to her husband the way that I just described the teacher saying something to the kid. Because that might be too much in a situation like that. For a teacher to a student, I think it feels appropriate. For a peer to a peer, meaning like in a spouse to a spouse, it almost might feel condescending or uncomfortable, like in a way that doesn't feel good. So I wouldn't do it explicitly. But implicitly, in her mind, Sarah can be communicating this to her husband's unconscious. She can be thinking when she notices his being more closed up, his more retreated, his being there even, doing great things but not being able to really be emotionally expressive. She can be thinking, I get it. I see you. I understand. I want this to be a place and a relationship for you that feels safe. So I'm not expecting anything more of you right now. I'm not pushing you. I'm not forcing you. I'm not pressuring you. She doesn't say any of these things out loud, but she thinks these things. Now, you might think I'm crazy. You might believe in this stuff. You might not believe in this stuff. But personally, I really believe that can create an energy, a sense on a level that is deeper than our conscious minds. It's something that the body perceives and experiences, something that the intuitive part of us feels and knows, that Sarah, in doing that, is actually creating a space in this relationship that her husband's unconscious self, the part of self that is instinctively seeking safety, is going to start feeling like this is a safe place, that this is okay, that this relationship is accepting of me. And paradoxically, what Sarah needs to know is that paradoxically, the more that the relationship accepts her husband for being non-emotional, the more emotional he can become. The more that it's okay for him to be however he is, without an expectation or a pressure to be something else, the more that he actually then can change. As one of the great psychological theorists once said, is that the ultimate paradox of human nature is that the more we accept ourselves, the more we change. And if she can create that conscious awareness in herself and intentionally communicate it to her husband's unconscious without words, she's creating that paradox of the more that there's acceptance, the more that there's a possibility of change. I don't think this is the whole answer, but I do think it's an important part of it, and maybe the most fundamental part, because it creates the container. It creates the platform and the stage on which all the other pieces can then exist. The other idea that I think can be helpful is to notice sometimes the lack of response is a form of response. What I mean by that is, if we go back to this concept that the lack of feeling is a way of creating a sense of safety because I need to fit in. Sometimes all it is the need to fit in. I don't want to say all it is, because that actually is very, very fundamental and very deep. But sometimes it's also more than that. If there is something that a person experienced in life that was very overwhelming, very painful, there's a good chance that they actually feel less emotion and less pain from that experience. Because when we have a moderate amount of pain, a moderate amount of distress and emotion, we can experience that. We can process that. Our system has the capacity, has the space for that. It's a digestible amount. It's an amount that we have the capacity to receive and feel and work through. But if the amount of pain or distress is so large, it's so big, so it's actually not something that our system feels the capacity to process and digest. So what it does is it just shuts off and doesn't feel it at all. And when that's what's going on, it can be very helpful to realize that the person who's not feeling is feeling. Or maybe not so much the word feeling, but the lack of reaction is the reaction. And in some ways, it's actually the biggest reaction, meaning the bigger the feeling is, oftentimes, the less that it actually will show up. That's why in therapy, when we're processing through major events and experiences and painful emotions, we have to titrate it, meaning we have to break it up into smaller pieces, because otherwise it's too much for the system to handle. So one of the things that I think is a very profound perspective to try and have, and one that I think can create a lot more tolerance, acceptance, spaciousness to relate to other people who might not have the same kinds of reactions that we want or expect them to have, is to understand that the lack of reaction is the reaction. And actually sometimes the lack of reaction is the biggest reaction. The lack of response is the biggest response. The not feeling is a reflection of the biggest feeling. And it really creates a different way of looking at that person, and again goes back to this perspective of creating an acceptance of that person. And that again can be communicated from the conscious to the unconscious. I can understand and I can communicate through the energy, through the body language, through my conscious to your unconscious. I can express a sense of understanding and acceptance, and that itself will allow for the possibility of a little bit more of the other person to show up over time. So instead of being frustrated by the person's lack of response, it's a reframing of seeing the lack of response as a version of a response. That is their response. Sometimes it's the biggest response. The next idea that I think can be helpful for Sarah in this kind of situation is to try and look for her spouse's, her husband's vulnerabilities, even when he isn't expressing them verbally with emotional language. What I mean by that is most people, many people, will have situations and moments where they feel stressed, they feel overwhelmed, they feel tired, not just in a physical way, that too. They feel annoyed or bothered or frustrated. They may not use any language that's more vulnerable in nature or more emotional than the language I just used. Annoyed, bothered, stressed, tired. Those are things that a lot of people express even when they don't have deep emotional capacity or deep emotional expression. And sometimes they may not even use those words, but they will act in that way, meaning they will act in a way that shows. They'll get home from work and there's kind of like that deep, heavy breath, right? And kind of dropping the bag on the floor and like plopping down on the couch or whatever it is, right? And we can look at all that. And from one perspective, we could look at that language that I gave before that might not be so emotionally expressive, but does express something. Or even if it's not language, it's just behavior. We can look at that and feel frustrated and think, because we're thinking, why aren't you being more vulnerable? Why can't you tell me what you're feeling? But the other way to look at it is, you just told me what you're feeling. Through that action, through that sigh, through that falling on the couch, through that very limited amount of expression. But in all of that, that was expression. You just expressed yourself in doing that. And now what I can do is I can experience that as you expressing yourself, and I can respond in the way that I would want to respond if you had expressed yourself with more emotional language or more vulnerability. I can respond in a way that offers support. I can respond in a way, not in an overwhelmingly gushy way, because the person might not have the understanding or the space to receive that. But I can respond in a loving, supportive, kind, sensitive way, almost as if you just told me something very vulnerable. I can respond with a type of care. So the person falls down on the couch or drops their bag when they walk in the door, and they may not say anything about what happened at work or what's going on, but we can respond in saying, like, seems like it must have been a tough day. Like, can I get you something? Or anything like that, right? Or, did something, anything going on, like with an open-ended question, but don't expect a deep response, or a sense of work work is a lot, or whatever it might be. But I can respond in a way of trying to act as being in connection with the vulnerability that just showed up, even if it didn't show up with the most vulnerable language. But that's what you just expressed through your behavior, through your action, and maybe through some basic language. The last thing I want to mention is that there also can be room, when we do this in the right way, for conversation. There's a kind of movement in general in the self-help world of telling women to. I just had a conversation with someone with a woman I just met who was telling me about how she felt that there's something that her husband religiously is not doing that she really wishes he did, and she knows that she's supposed to just be, she's not his mashkiach and his spiritual supervisor, and she's supposed to just be quiet about it and be supportive and not say anything. But she notices that one of her kids notice and is kind of uncomfortable by it, and the operating assumption she was making throughout telling me about this was, I know I'm not supposed to say anything. And I think that that's coming from this movement around, which the movement that I'm referring to is a movement that I think is a backlash to when there is the concept of the nagging or critical wife. And so because of that, what happens in the self-help world, unfortunately, so often is that people find a kernel of truth, and then they way oversimplify and over-superficialize it and start applying it as if it's the be-all and end-all for all situations. And so there was this issue of the nagging critical wife, which does exist, the person who's overly critical, overly nagging. And in response to that, there was this idea that was developed of never really, of being more appreciative, never criticizing, never nagging, and just letting your spouse do what they do and showing respect. And there's a deep kernel of truth in that. There's a very important, actually a big part of that is informing what I've shared so far until now in this episode about how to respond to the husband who's not as emotionally vulnerable as the wife wants. But to just say that means that we can't talk about anything, we can't say what we're feeling, we can't bring up a conversation, is a very sad state. And is certainly not the answer in any kind of oversimplified, all or nothing way, and certainly not for all relationships. And so in this conversation, I asked this woman, do you have a good relationship with your husband? The one who was telling me about the religious aspect, and she was assuming that, of course, I can't say anything to him. And she was coming from this mentality that she had heard from all the magazine articles and all the podcasts and the self-help things that unfortunately in the from world has become one of the ideas that has swept through the world of these kinds of publications, again, in a way that has a very real truth, but has become way oversimplified and over-exaggerated. And I said, do you have a good relationship? And she said, yes. And like, are you able to talk about things? And she said, yes. I said, so why are you assuming that you can't say anything? And she stopped and realized, and she shared how she has read, about that concept, and that's what everyone seems to write about and say. And I paused and I said, listen, there's a real truth in that. And when a person's relationship is not in a great place, sometimes they can't necessarily talk about those things. But that's unfortunate. That's when the relationship is not in a good place. Part of having a good relationship is that we can talk about these things. Doesn't mean we're going to solve them all right away. And especially in our situation with Sarah, where her husband's not going to be able to just change in a moment. And it's not going to work to pressure him into having more emotional depth. That's not going to work, as we explained already. But that doesn't mean there can't be a respectful, open, genuine conversation about it. And I do think it's something that she can bring up, if she can do it in the right way, to bring up that it's something that she wants. She wants to feel more connected. She wants to feel that there's more expression of what we're each feeling. And she can express this to him in a positive way. That when you show me what you're feeling, or you tell me about something, or you come to me for help or support or care, it makes me feel much closer to you, and I feel really good about it. So instead of expressing it as a criticism, it can be expressed as a positive, as an invitation. And that brings me to the last point, which is when there is any amount of that expression that is there, to really try, not in an overwhelming way, but to try and highlight it and to try and appreciate it and value it, because then that'll bring out more of it going forward. So these are the different ideas. Number one, speaking from the conscious to the unconscious, from the perspective of understanding that the avoidance or the emotional suppression was a safety-seeking instinct. The second is reframing the lack of response as the response. The third is noticing the vulnerabilities, even if they're not being expressed as vulnerabilities, and responding to them from the place of understanding that the limited expression, or even just the behavior itself, is the expression of a vulnerability, of an emotion. It's just being expressed not through words, but through behaviors, or through a more limited language of words. And the last is the possibility of actually having a conversation. Not that it's a conversation that's going to change everything, but it's a conversation that can open a door and can be an ongoing conversation in the right way, and with a sense of appreciation and the noticing an expression of when it is there in a way that can make the person actually feel appreciated and seen, and positive about the possibility of doing more of this kind of engagement and more of this kind of relationship in their life.